I want to begin by thanking all of you who joined us this morning in the opening session of our 2020 Summer School. And it gives me great honor to participate in this session along with two formidable women whom I admire, Professor Sandra Almeida, our president, and our distinguished guest, Mrs. Patrícia Campos Melo. The Summer School is a project I'm very proud of, having presented the idea to the previous dean and developing it with some colleagues, one of them, Professor Davidson Lopez, my current deputy dean. I have seen it grow its reach and perfect its functioning every year since we have begun. In this edition, we have 61 students from 33 institutions located in 21 different countries. The course's main purpose is to offer a solid introduction of Brazil to students from partner institutions. Certainly, since our first edition, it has become more difficult to explain Brazil as we are in the midst of a pandemic, without a Minister for Health Affairs, without a Minister for Education, with members of the government trying to pick up a fight with our main commercial partner, and with a president of the Republic, who, in addition to have called COVID-19 a little cold, denies having responsibility in fighting it. How we got here is a question we'll try to answer in the following days, and you will be able to judge our success or failure by the end of the course. Our distinguished speaker, Ms. Campos Melo, has played a very important role in helping us understand it. She published a story on what we'll, for now, call alleged electoral crimes in the campaign of candidate Jair Bolsonaro regarding distribution of fake messages. For this reason, she was cited in Times Magazine, Choice of Person of the Year, and as a journalist victim of persecution. Ms. Campos Melo graduated from the School of Communication and Arts at the University of São Paulo and has a master's degree in business and economic reporting from New York University. She is a reporter and columnist for Folha de São Paulo, Brazil's most important daily newspaper, besides serving since 2019 as a member of its editorial board. As a correspondent in Washington for another major newspaper, Estado de São Paulo, she covered the attacks of September 11th, the American economic crisis, the war in Afghanistan, not to mention the presidential elections of 2008, 2012, 2016. At the White House, she interviewed former President George W. Bush. Patrícia has been to Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Libya, Lebanon, and Kenya several times, reporting on refugees and war, having been sent as a special reporter to conflict zones. But as I was mentioning, Patrícia Campos Melo is the author of Is the World Afraid of China? So Are We, the greatest enigma of the world economy, Honeymoon in Cobain, India, From Misery to Power, and soon to be out, The Hate Machine, Notes from a Reporter on Fake News and Digital Violence. Patrícia Campos Melo idealized the award-winning project World of Walls, a multimedia special about migration crisis carried out on 4 continents. She is a senior fellow at the Brazilian Center for International Relations, and for her performance, she received in 2016 the trophy Mulher Imprensa, a Brazilian award that aims at recognizing the work of women in newsrooms. She got an award in 2017 from the International Committee of the Red Cross, and in 2018, she received the International King of Spain Journalism Award, the same award that she also received, the same year that she also received the Petrobras Journalism Award. In 2019, she was awarded the International Press Freedom Prize from the Committee for the Protection of Journalists. I would like to and by saying that access to information has never been so relevant in our lifetime, and that such information will come from scientists, from universities, and through the work of excellent professional journalists such as Patrícia Campos Melo. And before giving her the floor, I'd like to thank Professor Lucas Lima, who is serving this year as our academic coordinator, Professor Davidson, my deputy dean, our staff from the Office of International Affairs, who has done an excellent job in preparing this summer school for our students, and our staff from the Office of International, of our interpreters, Mr. Bacon and Luciene, Marcelo from our Accessibility Center. So without further delay, I give the floor to Ms. Patrícia Campos Melo. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? Okay.
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, sure. Well, good morning, everyone. I am honored and humbled to be here today. It is a great privilege to speak with students from 27 different countries enrolled at the Summer School on Brazilian Studies at Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais. Would like to thank Professor Sandra Goulart Almeida, President of the great Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, for the wonderful and generous words and for being a female and a president of this great university. Would like to thank Professor Davidson Belém Lopes, Deputy Dean for International Affairs, and Professor Aziz Toufi Saliba, Dean for International Affairs, for the invitation. I thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about the situation of the media and institutions in Brazil. And I'm sure many of you may be going through similar circumstances in the countries where you live. On May 25th, the main media outlets in Brazil announced they would no longer send journalists to cover the impromptu press briefings of President Jair Bolsonaro at Alvorada Palace in Brasília. Folha, O Globo, Valor Econômico, TV Globo, and others did not have an option. It was no longer safe to send journalists. That same day, in the morning, supporters of the president had approached the area reserved for journalists and once again began to yell at them and curse. They were yelling, "Rats, rats, rotten press, communists." There were dozens of people shouting, and they were less than 50 centimeters from the reporters' area without masks in the middle of the pandemic. 3 weeks earlier, the photojournalists Gida Sampaio from Estadão had been pushed, kicked, and punched in the stomach during a protest in favor of President Bolsonaro and in favor of closing Congress and Supreme Court. The increasingly aggressive rhetoric and actions against the press by the president, his sons, and some allies act as a green light for supporters to engage in actual aggression. The president has already told more than one journalist to shut up, literally. He said once to a reporter that he had the, and I quote, terrible look of a homosexual. He has called newspapers and TVs the worst names. He put pressure on private advertisers to stop advertising in critical media. He cut government advertising. He tried to implement measures that would affect revenues of media outlets. And I could go on and on if I were to list everything that the current administration has done in order to try to suffocate critical media. The situation is especially critical for female journalists. We are the target of defamation campaigns stimulated and amplified by the government. Much more frequently than our male colleagues, we have our parents and our children intimidated, our appearance mocked, our addresses and phone numbers exposed, and we are subject to violent threats, both online and in the real world. Since February this year, thousands of memes have circulated in the internet in which my face appears in pornographic montages, calling me a prostitute and alluding to sexual organs. I get messages from people saying that I offer sex in exchange for scoops and that I should be raped. This smear campaign became overwhelming after Congressman Eduardo Bolsonaro, one of the president's sons, and President Jair Bolsonaro amplified and spread these sexual offenses on live TV and social media. I'm not the only one to endure this type of aggression. Respected female journalists in Brazil, such as Miriam Leitão, Vera Magalhães, Thalita Fernandes, Constança Rezende, Marina Dias, and many, many others are and were targets of misogynistic offenses. The use of social media to mold the narrative and to attack journalists, members of the opposition, and activists is an integral part of the modern populist's playbook. I remember when I first interviewed Steve Bannon, former White House chief strategist, back in October 2018. At the time, he said that were it not for Facebook, Twitter, and other social media platforms, it would have been 100 times more difficult for populism to rise, because populists would not be able to overcome the barrier of the traditional media. Bypassing the filter of traditional media and communicating directly with supporters through social media is essential to so-called techno-populists such as Bolsonaro, Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, Prime Minister Narendra Modi in India, and of course, Donald Trump in the US. So attacking traditional media and discrediting journalists is part of the strategy of establishing a direct channel with supporters, with no fact-checking, no questioning, no accountability whatsoever. Like other increasingly illiberal democracies, Bolsonaro does not need to rely on classical censorship to silence the opposition and the media. He floods social media with so-called alternative facts, drowning out investigations about his government and negative news. And he runs intimidation campaigns against journalists, both online and in the real world. With the withdrawal of journalists from presidential briefings, media outlets lost one of the rare opportunities we had to question the president about the issues that really affect the country. After Bolsonaro constantly sabotaged the social isolation implemented by the state governments, the gripezinha, that's how he called COVID-19, a regular cold, just a common cold, has already killed over 65,000 people in Brazil, the second highest death toll in the world. But anyone who gets his or her information only from government social media or from the numerous blogs and YouTube channels of Bolsonaristas cannot imagine the magnitude of the catastrophe. The government no longer shows in its social media accounts the number of deaths caused by COVID-19. The Bolsonaro government announces only what it calls the scoreboard of life, that celebrates the number of patients saved and undergoing treatment and omits the number of deaths. The Ministry of Health even tried to change the accounting method, using incomplete statistics that ended up omitting part of the death toll. It was stopped by a Supreme Court ruling. On top of the pandemic, the currency that depreciated the most in 2020 was the Brazilian real. There was a record flight of foreign investment, and there are more than 13 million people unemployed. The Brazilian president desperately needs factoids and enemies to divert attention from the humanitarian disaster that unfolds in the country. We can see the same thing happening in the US, where Trump keeps attacking the press and social movements while the country faces twin crises, the pandemic and social unrest. But the COVID-19 pandemic showed the limitations of the populists' plan of creating enemies to overshadow concrete problems. President Trump and President Bolsonaro are among the very few heads of state who did not benefit from a rally around the flag effect during the pandemic. Both experienced a fall in approval rates. Confronted with gross mismanagement that led to thousands of unnecessary deaths, many voters soured on Bolsonaro and Trump. This shows that the strategy of polarization, manipulation of public opinion through social media, and the deployment of ideological ghosts is not so effective when life and death decisions are at stake, even when there's systematic intimidation campaigns of journalists, opposition legislator, academia, and scientific think tanks. So with that, I would like to tell you that I'm sure many of you are facing similar circumstances in the countries where you live, and this is a global problem. This attempt to silence opposition and media, and the use of social media to manipulate public opinion. But I do think that the COVID-19 pandemic and the horrible humanitarian catastrophe is unmasking several governments, populist governments, and their gross mismanagement of the crisis. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Patrícia Campos Melo, for the excellent address. We do have some questions for you. Would like to say that it's always a pleasure, but before I would like to say that it's always a pleasure to listen to you. And again, that we are very honored to have you as this year's speaker, as I think you symbolize the best that Brazil can provide in a crisis like this. Can provide an intelligent reaction to the problems we are facing, to the complex situation that we are facing. Now, I would like to know, Ms. Campos Melo, to what extent you believe social media, you have touched that during your speech, but to what extent social media, Twitter, Facebook, have influenced, and WhatsApp, of course, which is not a social media, it is a way of people used to communicate. But to which extent have they helped Bolsonaro's election?
Thank you for your question, Professor. And I hope you can hear me well, because the internet connection here is not very stable. So I'm not sure if the whole speech, if you could hear it. Well, okay, cool. So your question is the $1 billion question. There's no academic research, no quantitative research that shows to what extent social media disinformation campaigns can sway votes. I mean, we don't know if they can, if social media campaigns, or if the use of the manipulation of public opinion, if it can change a vote, actually, or if you can at least make people not show up to vote, like voter suppression in the US. We don't know that for sure. There are no figures, there are no quantitative analysis on that. However, even if it does make very few people to decide not to show up for elections, or to change their vote, or to try to convince other people, even if it's a very small effect, that may be enough to change the outcome of several elections. We've seen lately that several elections are very close calls, such as the 2016 US election, the Brexit referendum, and even some elections in Brazil. So The truth is, no one knows for sure what's the magnitude of the effect of social media disinformation campaigns in the vote of people. But we do know that even if it's very small, it's still very important that we deal with this issue and we address it, because the fact is, no one knows how to deal with this. Not a single country has been able to solve this question, and we are all trying to do this.
Thank you very much. Ms. Denise Alves asks you to talk a little bit about violence against women during this pandemic crisis, and additionally, the role that Bolsonaro has played with his speeches in fostering this situation.
I think violence, especially online violence towards women, it's a global phenomenon, but it's much more common in Brazil and in India, in the Philippines also to some extent. And you see, it's easy to see this. If you follow social media, you're going to see that the type of attacks that are targeted towards women journalists or women legislators are very misogynistic. They're not attacking our work. They're attacking either our appearance or our families, or calling us names. It's never about the work. So you can see this very clearly. And this is very I remember once when people ask me, what it is like to be a woman journalist when you're covering conflicts, for instance, when you go to cover the war in Syria or some other sort of hostile environments. And I used to say it is much easier to be a woman than people imagine, because we have a privilege. We have access to half the population that the male journalists don't have access to. We can speak freely to women in conservative countries. So I do think it's a privilege that to be a woman in these circumstances. However, in Brazil, which is supposedly not a very conservative country, it has made us, targets. Women are much more frequently targeted for attacks than men. So I think this is a very unfortunate thing that is happening in Brazil. And the second question, sorry if you could repeat it, but now I can't hear you.
The second question was the impact that Bolsonaro's speeches have on violence against women.
Oh, I think it's huge. It does work as a green light for his supporters to engage in violent speech and violent actions. I mean, if you think about, if you have a head of state saying every other day that journalists are, scoundrels, that we're fake news, that we're communists, and saying things that are really, against women, it's not, and against gay people and against professors. I mean, it just works. It's like it becomes something that is allowed. It sort of authorizes other people to emulate what he's doing, and even increase and engage in actual actual acts of physical violence. So that's why it's so important. The words of people who are in government, the words of chiefs of states, they are very important, because they work as examples, something like people follow this. So that's why we tend to underestimate the importance of these words and of the verbal effect of speeches of people in power. But they do have consequences, very serious consequences.
We do have lots of questions coming, so I will try to pick some and summarize some of the questions and put some together. There are also many people thanking you for the excellent speech here, many of the students who are participating with us. So one of the questions is, how can you envisage a situation where the president, Jair Bolsonaro, changed his strategy on COVID-19 if things get even more out of hand, even worse?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, just this disclaimer, but I think it does not suit his ideological base. I mean, it's a very ingrained belief among extreme right-wing politicians that there is an exaggeration in the reaction and in the measures adopted to combat COVID-19, and the WHO recommended guidelines. There is this ideological defense of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. So I think that at this point, for Bolsonaro to do a U-turn and say, actually, I do support social isolation. I think there's no evidence of the efficacy of chloroquine. I think this would be really, really. His base would be so unhappy about this that he risks alienating his base. So I don't see him doing this U-turn on the COVID-19 response.
Okay. Another question that we have here from Davidson is, do you believe this is a global phenomena in scope? What is the underlying factor these events have that connect us all?
Wow. Well, this is a question that for sure you, Professor Aziz, and Professor Davison would answer much more with much more knowledge than I would. But I do think it is a global phenomenon. It's like the populism. It's not that populism is a new thing, but the techno-populism, this is a phrase that was coined by Giuliano da Empoli, who's an Italian author who writes about this, has certain characteristics, certain common characteristics, such as in this new populism and authoritarian governments, as you all know, you don't need to have an outright dictatorship. You're just eroding democratic pillars from inside, right? You have elected authoritarian leaders. And at the same time, social media is essential for this, because this is how you're going to control the narrative. This is how you're going to keep the core of your supporters, sort of seeing the narrative that you want them to see. So I think that what differentiates disinformation is not new, populism is not new, but I do think that social media and the whole change in the information ecosystem, the way people have access to information and the way you can choose to listen only to what endorses your beliefs, this changes everything, and this increases the reach of this new technological populism. And I can give you several examples. Rodrigo Duterte, president of the Philippines, is really, really avid user of social media and uses it, and also, repressing media and opposition. Erdogan in Turkey, of course, Donald Trump, Bolsonaro, and then you have some differing, like, of course, Viktor Orban in Hungary, the Freedom, Justice and Freedom Party in Poland. It is a global phenomenon for sure.
So I will here use part of the question posed by Ana Luisa Oliveira. Do you see any responsibility of these social media platforms in the spread of misinformation or fake news? And what can we do to prevent these misinformation campaigns that many politicians, such as the ones that you have mentioned here, have run?
Thank you. Excellent question, Ana Luisa. This is what the world is discussing now. We have, on the one hand, people trying to legislate. I mean, up until now, you have had a virtual immunity of the platforms, the social media platforms, because that's the only way that internet and social media could exist. If you were to make the platforms accountable to what people wrote or said in the social media, in the platforms, it would basically make internet impossible to exist, because they would never be want to take this liability. So what Marco Serviu da Internet and also some rules in the US made is they gave the conditions for internet and social media to exist. If you were to make platforms responsible for everything that is said and done in their platforms, this would make internet not viable, right? At the same time, we got to a point that the platforms, social media, is eroding democracy around the world, right? So it's no longer okay just to make them, we're not publishers, we're just distributing content. No, they have to have some sort of responsibility. And there comes the big question. Are we going to legislate over this? Are we going to adopt a law? Which is dangerous, as we have seen in several Asian countries, that might criminalize free speech in several instances. Or on the other hand, might we have a reaction from the market? What we're seeing now of big advertisers such as Unilever, several companies, I think Levi's, Verizon, they're just boycotting and no longer advertising on Facebook because Facebook is not doing anything against hate speech. This is a very interesting reaction. But I do think that we cannot leave all that to the market forces. We do need to legislate. There needs to be some sort of regulation, but we have to be very, very careful. We are at this exact point in time discussing legislation, discussing a bill in Congress to regulate fake news. It has some positive aspects. It has some dangerous aspects. So I think it has to be a combination of market reaction, boycotting platforms who are not doing enough to stop hate speech and disinformation, but also legislation that is very carefully written and addresses some of those issues.
Ms. Campos Melo, still on that matter, there is a question from Arina Galitsina. I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name, Arina, which she also conveys her satisfaction for such a fascinating speech, and she asks if there is anything that we can do to raise people's awareness and consciousness when it comes to reading news.
Thank you so much for your question, Irina. Hope I'm not mispronouncing your name. There's been a lot of discussion about media literacy, teaching people that you should check the facts and not just share any piece of news that you receive, and you need to fact check and resort to fact checking agencies and check the sources. I am a little skeptical about this. For instance, in Brazil, we have and I'm not sure about the figures, but let's say 25% of the people are functional illiterate, right? They can only read and write their names. They don't really understand what they're reading. On top of all, we have several people who are not functional illiterate, but they're only open to listening to whatever endorses their previous beliefs. It's the confirmation bias that we say. And the other thing, some of the cell phone operators, they have this zero rating program that you can access without using your data package. You can access only WhatsApp and Facebook or some others. So what are the odds that someone who gets a video on WhatsApp is going to get out of WhatsApp and go on Google to research to see if that's true or not? I don't think it's very realistic to expect people to do that. I don't think you shouldn't be fact checking. We have to fact check. We have to spread the correct version of the news. But at the same time, I don't think we can expect that much from people in terms of being proactive and, doing research to see if the news and the stuff they're sharing, if it's truth. So I think it's necessary. I'm not sure how effective it is.
Well, there are many other questions here. So for me, it's a great experience to interview a great interviewer. Haven't done that before. So Ms. Campos Melo, I try to put together two questions here. One asked by Victor, and another one which was posed by Adam Kearney. The question regards the role that far right and fake news blogs and websites are playing in shaping the debate, the political debate, and to what extent they are leading to attacks right now, especially attacks gender on women, gender attacks.
I think it's interesting how if you were to get your information only from this right-wing blogs or the social media profiles that support the government and the government social media accounts, you would have a completely different view of what's happening right now and of what are opposition parties, what are the media. So if we know from polling that there's a 15% of the population are core supporters of President Bolsonaro. They voted for him, they support him no matter what. And I'm sure the reality of these people is shaped by these right-wing blogs. If you have in these right-wing blogs and some of the government allies, if they are sharing and spreading these demeaning views on women, on journalists, on professors, on science, of course, they are shaping the views of at least 15% of the population. So yes, I do agree that they play a very important role in this environment of violence against everything that is different or that is considered communist, which I think it's very puzzling. I mean, it's such a vintage thinking to talk about communism in Brazil today, but that's what's become, anyone who's slightly different becomes a communist.
So I'll try now to put together two questions here from Carrie Bell and from Rebecca Anita Miyagi from Indonesia, from the Sepul Mupember Institute of Technology. The questions deal with the delicate balance between fake news and freedom of speech. Because on one hand, you want to regulate fake news, but on the other hand, you do not want to limit free speech more than necessary. So I would like your intake on that. How can we regulate fake news without hurting free speech?
Excellent question. I think we have to be careful not to turn this into a binary debate. Either you have no regulation or any kind of regulation is going to violate your right to freedom of speech. I think there is a middle road. There is something that we can combine both. There is a big danger, and we have seen this in Singapore and Vietnam, how to weaponize fake news legislation against journalists and against opposition legislators. So this fear is real, and I understand why several parts of the civil society, several NGOs are very worried about the legislation that is being discussed right now in Brazil. On the other hand, I don't think it is sustainable not to have any kind of legislation. I think that some of the things, there's consensus of some of the ways to legislate disinformation campaigns. The main thing is we do not legislate content because we don't want to have a ministry of truth. We can legislate financing of professional disinformation campaigns. People who are financing, sponsoring this in a professional way. And we also can legislate over the tools used, like automated tools should be labeled so that people know they're interacting with automated, with robots, with bots. Also so-called inauthentic accounts, if you can prove, and that's kind of difficult, that they are engaging, they are pretending to be someone they are not in order to achieve illegal objectives or something. So we should focus on legislating not content, but the tools they're using and also the financing. I think this way we could achieve some sort of middle of the road, middle ground solution that you're not violating freedom of speech, but at the same time, you're not just not doing anything because you're paralyzed, because the current situation is not sustainable.
There is another question from Adeyumo Peter, and the question is, what measures do you take to assure your safety and that of your family while doing journalism?
That's an excellent question. It's ironic. In 2018, at some point, I had to have a bodyguard because people had my phone number. They were calling in and threatening and mentioning my son. So it became really, really tough. And it was very sad because I was in my town in São Paulo, just covering the elections. I was not in some of the countries I had been before, like Syria, Iraq, or Libya, where I never had a bodyguard, because I just think this is disrespectful to whoever lives in the countries that are difficult, that are going through difficult situations. And then all of a sudden I saw myself with a bodyguard in my country. Nowadays, I don't have any kind of security. I just do my job. I don't really, if you think too much, you don't do anything. At that time, yes, we had, concrete threats, concrete danger. So I had this bodyguard, but that now, I don't know, not doing anything.
Okay, and we hope that you remain safe. Patricia, the other question comes from Rihanna Fig, and regards the media being allowed at presidential addresses. How does the president interact with the press right now, especially the major newspapers like Folha de São Paulo? I think we Brazilians are more familiar with it than our foreign students.
Exactly right now, there's an attempt of, having some sort of truce. So in the last few days, we haven't seen any direct attack against the press. But for you to have an idea, the media outlets decided no longer to send their professionals, their journalists, to those impromptu press briefings, because journalists were humiliated daily there. You had a president, saying, "Shut up," literally. I don't think I've ever seen anyone tell, in a press briefing, or making demeaning comments. And then you had these people, his supporters, whom he was sort of inflaming these people, inciting these people against the journalists. So it is a very hostile environment towards the press. I'm not even getting into, the executive orders that the president tried to adopt to cut revenues of newspapers. He actually said that their aim was to cut revenues. So it is I'll give you an example. The other day, I have a Venezuelan friend. She's a journalist. She lives in Brazil. And she said, I'm really scared because this kind of attacks against the press that sometimes rely on supporters reminds me very much of Chavez in Venezuela and the colectivos. There were those those groups, right? And the way that it started like this and it ended up with, journalists in prison, opposition candidates in prison. And my reaction was, well, the institutions in Brazil are working, we have democracy, he was elected. And she said, this is what happened in Venezuela. He was elected, institutions were working, and then everything went downhill. But in Brazil, it's happening much, much faster. So this is basically the scene, the environment we're living now.
Do you believe that institutions in Brazil are working properly in the midst of this crisis?
Yes, I think the checks and balances system in Brazil, the institutions are very effective in sort of barring or obstructing the authoritarian impulses of the president. If you look at all the Supreme Court decisions or Congress decisions, Congress did not vote or somehow barred authoritarian measures. Supreme Court also, we can think of several measures of the Supreme Court. They did not let, when Bolsonaro wanted to interfere in the ability of state governments to legislate over social isolation, Supreme Court stopped this. Supreme Court acted now with the transparency of Ministry of Health statistics. Several instances. Up until now, both judiciary system, mainly Supreme Court, and Congress, and independent media, they have been able to act as checks and balances and act as some sort of limit or as a watchdog to the president.
The next question comes from our colleague, Professor Guilherme Casarões. He asks you, how do you see the growing mobilization of high-ranked ambassadors attacking the press to defend the legacy of Bolsonaro's presidency? And as a journalist, do you see it as a form of censorship? To what extent is it unprecedented in democracies, especially in those places where you have been, right?
Well, thank you, Guilherme. Guilherme is a good friend, I'm also a fan. I think it's just sad what these ambassadors are doing, because you're an ambassador of the state. You're not the ambassador of a specific president. You're not to act as his defender. And there is freedom of the press. They are arguing against op-eds, against editorials. That's their opinion. If there's, factual error, if there's actual mistakes, of course, you ask for correction. But they are fighting with editors of El País, for instance, in Spain. I've written about this, and other countries, against their opinion. It's, freedom of the press. That's how it works. Opinion is free. If there's some factual error, if something is actually wrong, yes, you demand a correction. If the case be, you demand, damages, you sue the person. But other than that, opinion is free. So I think it's very sad and actually humiliating that some diplomats, Itamaraty is one of the greatest institutions of Brazil. We have such amazing people, amazing diplomats. They're so smart and they're so dedicated. And you have some of them, they're willing to do anything to defend specific government officials. It's not the state, it's specific government.
Um, the one question here, I'll try to put it together with another question. The question comes from Victor, and I'll try to put it together with a question from Rick Giganto from the Philippines. We currently have a bill before the Brazilian Congress which addresses the issue of fake news. So we would like to know what you think about this bill. And we also would like to know how do you see, how do you project Bolsonaro's government going? Do you think that we will try to take steps in the future to silence the voice of Brazilians and to silence the social unrest with the government's incompetence to address the current health crisis?
Well, the current bill under consideration in Congress, it passed, Senate passed the bill, and now it goes to the House. I think it has, it's much better than it used to be. The authors and the relator, I don't know how to say that in English, the legislator who takes the what?
Rapporteur,
yeah. They did accept several recommendations of civil society, and they improved the legislation a lot. So there's some things in terms of transparency, the platforms having to inform every quarter, I think, or every 2 months or 3 months or 6 months quarter. Yeah. What have they done in terms of addressing complaints and dealing with automated accounts, blah, blah. I think this is healthy and this is good. There's some things that might be dangerous in terms of tracking WhatsApp. What they want to do is to make it mandatory for WhatsApp and other message applications have the complete way to track a message. And this is tricky because it might obligate platforms to store a humongous amount of information and data about people. So there are legitimate privacy concerns. However, in Congress, we have already some changes suggested that might address the need to make these, sponsors of fake news campaigns accountable in terms of tracking messages in WhatsApp without make the bill better. So I'm one of the few people who are actually optimistic. I think they're gonna eliminate the bad parts and be able to approve.
Yeah, apparently, Patricia, she's experiencing some technical problems.
Yes.
We'll just wait for her.
And there was a glitch there, and then she disappeared.
Now she's back.
Sorry, I'm back. Internet is not very stable here, so.
Don't worry. Patricia, the other question, I'll try to put two questions together here again. One comes from Gustavo Costa. He's a student at the university, at Texas University. And Matias Garcia Fallet, a student from UBA, Texas studies. We did have Bolsonaro in Brazil winning the elections and Trump in the US. Why do you think, what factors do you think explain their victories? Is society in some way responsible for underestimating critical thinking?
In what sense, underestimating critical thinking?
I believe that what Matia Garcia's meant was perhaps because people would accept fake news for their face value, right?
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps they were not prepared to deal with fake news. They were taking at face value instead of taking it critically.
Sorry, in terms of what led to the election, again, Professor Aziz, Professor Davison, you're much more qualified to answer this, but my feeling is that there's two things. One is that, I mean, Brazil has some particular issues. In the world, there's been some, research saying that we had the so-called orphans of globalization, people who were not, who did not benefit from globalization. They were excluded, and you had this mass of people who were really not satisfied with things, how things were going, with this attempt to, have a universal thinking, and it depends on which country. I mean, in Europe, immigration was a big part of it. In the US, free trade and immigration were big parts of it. In Brazil, I think we also had another ingredient, which was we had years and years of one party, PT, in power. There were corruption scandals, and people really, there was this very negative feeling, very anti-PT feeling that helped towards the election of Bolsonaro. So I think in general, you could say that we had several years of center-left, center governments around the world who actually were not catering to the needs of a part of the population, or even being condescending and patronizing towards some parts of the population. And then there was this backlash. In Brazil, there was this very specific ingredient of the anti-PT feeling.
There is a question from Mr. Francisco Espinosa, a Chilean sociology at the University of Manchester in the UK. He states that fake news along violence exaltation seems to be aimed at excluding or refraining their opposition from participating at the time that they radicalize their own base, their own supporters. But to what extent is a strategy like this sustainable? Can their audiences turn into a real political force, or do you believe they will be short-lived?
Excellent question. I think the pandemic showed the limitations of such a strategy. There's a limit as to what you can do with fake news and disinformation campaigns. If you're dealing with debts, there's only so much you can cover up or try to manipulate the narrative. So I think this pandemic, this horrible humanitarian disaster we were living, showed the limitations of this strategy. At the same time, if you think about Brazil, if you think about the economy, the state of the economy in Brazil, over 65,000 deaths. We're the second highest death toll in the world. Economy, unemployment is horrible. There's political crisis. There's corruption investigations affecting one of the sons of the president. With all that, he maintains a 32% approval rate. So I do think there is some resilience in this phenomenon. I don't think it's just going to pass. And my fear is what my Venezuelan friend told me, that you radicalize this core group of supporters, let's say 15%, 20%, as to weaponize this, to turn them into militias. Up until now, you say, people were just being aggressive online, but we've seen in some instances, such as when the photojournalist was punched and kicked, that, there's a very thin limit, to when it can turn into physical aggression. And so I do think there's some resilience, and we can see this in the approval rates. If you consider everything that is happening in Brazil now, it's amazing that there's still 32% people, 30% people who approve of his government. And there is a danger that these the core group of supporters, the people who are really ideological and believe, they're true believers, they get weaponized and they turn into aggressive, like colectivos from Chavez.
Now, two questions, one from Isabel Avila and from UFMG, and the other one from Shishla MacLeod from the University of Auckland. Do you think that Brazil's dictatorial past has any role in the current situation? The fact that we had a dictatorship before, does it influence to any extent the current situation? And additionally, do you believe that Bolsonaro enjoys the support from the army and that he can, in the future, become a dictator?
Wow. First question, second question about the army. I will be super honest. I don't have enough information on that to answer. I'm not a specialist in the army. I don't have information or sources, so I'm not sure. I've been reading a lot, as you guys probably have. The retired, not sure if you say retired military personnel, how do they see Bolsonaro, and the ones who are still in the active, blah, blah. So I'm not sure what is the current status of his support among armed forces. In terms of the military dictatorship, absolutely. I think we have, first, that we have many people that either are nostalgic towards what happened, or some people they didn't live the military dictatorship, so they don't know what happened exactly. They have this false impression about what was happening and that there was an economic miracle. So the fact that we haven't had a proper, how can I say this, reconciliation, like people discussing everything that's happening, accountability, that might play a big role in what we're living right now.
And do you think, how do you think, Ms. Campos Melo, this is a question from Isadora Nepomuceno, she's a student at UFMG. How do you think students can make a difference against all these fake news and minority attacks in our country?
Well, I think you are the hope. You are seeing everything that is happening, and you are doing research. You are getting deep into things, and you can share this knowledge, this wonderful knowledge that you're getting, and spread this knowledge, just actual knowledge based on science. There's only you can only fight bad information with good information, I think, or fake. There's not there's limited there's not much that law can do, or governors. So I think that the fact that we have students like you who are doing real research, who are working with information and knowledge, and the fact that you're going to go on and spread this knowledge. This is what really, really is going to make a difference.
We'll just take another couple of questions, and I promise that this interview will be over. Ms. Campos Melo, do you think that, because we see, and this I will take on a question which was asked by Cheng Yang from the Chinese University of Hong Kong in Shenzhen. Do you think right now Bolsonaro supporters are migrating from WhatsApp to other platforms, to other social networks, right? Instead of using WhatsApp, which has put some limits in the number of messages that you can forward, they're now using Telegram. And do you think that Telegram and the other social networks that they are resourcing to will have the same success, that they'll be able to have the same level of success that they were able to have with WhatsApp and Facebook and so on?
The Telegram migration is not new. I mean, there's been some time since last year that part of the militants, the most strong supporters, they have been telling people, let's migrate to Telegram because there's no limitation, the number of people in a group or the number of times you can forward a message. However, if you think about Brazil is the second largest market for WhatsApp. The first one is India, has I think like 300 million, 400 million, something, but for a population of 1.3 billion. In Brazil, we have a population of 209 million, and we have 130 million users of WhatsApp. So it's really pervasive. I think it's going to be hard, not impossible, but it's going to take a while for another app to replace WhatsApp, just because WhatsApp, every single person in Brazil has WhatsApp. I mean, pretty much every single person. And they use, because of the 0 rating thing, they use it to make phone calls. So I know there's been a migration. It's not new. I think it might happen, but it might take a while because WhatsApp is really, really pervasive in Brazil.
Those apps, WhatsApp and Telegram, they work with confidentiality. It's extremely difficult to find out about the content of messages exchanged between people because of their confidentiality and their and also the level of encoding that they use. What is more important in your view? Is it to have people able to exchange messages that they know will not be for safety? This is also a question from Cheng Yang from the Chinese University of Hong Kong.
I think privacy is really important. The fact that you have encrypted messages in WhatsApp is essential. It's not only because, we want to have privacy. Privacy is sometimes viewed as something that is abstract. If you think about a country that a government can be monitoring and using messages, private messages, to persecute people, and this happens in several countries, the fact that you have one app that really guarantees privacy with encryption is essential. However, I don't think that excludes the fact that you can trace or track criminal organizations that are using apps that are encrypted, because you can do this without having access to content. You can use this using the metadata, the logs, the register logs. So there are ways of making professional or organizations that are sponsoring disinformation and other crimes using social media. You can make them accountable without breaking encryption, without violating privacy.
Another question. I know that this will interest. It's from Thomas Edwards. He's a student at the University of York. But this is something that interests me very much. It also interests my colleagues, Davison and Guilherme. How do you think that Bolsonaro's supporters view the international power and reputation of Brazil? Do you think that if they could see that there is a lot of international backlash against Bolsonaro, that would influence them in any way? Would they lose faith in him?
I think, I mean, if you look at the reactions, when you have like a critical story at The Economist, and they say, oh, this is a left-wing magazine, I think in terms of, you can turn this, the international condemnation, in your favor as saying, you know, these people want to violate the sovereignty of Brazil. They're trying to interfere with internal matters. And this international media is all left-wing. There's part of the Bolsonaro supporters that believe this, you know, these are just people, and in terms of the environment, oh, the Europeans are being hypocritical. Once they destroyed the forest, now they want to preach. To some part of his supporters, this is effective. However, I think the fact that you have funds, like funds that manage trillions of dollars, literally, in Europe and other places that are threatening and are boycotting companies in Brazil and exports from Brazil, that might change the opinion, because that's have effects. You can say, okay, so this is the left-wing media, and you put there the Wall Street Journal and the Economist, and it's just really absurd, but to some people it makes sense and they believe it. But when you start to sense, you have real effects, concrete effects of this behavior that is condemned everywhere in the world, maybe that might influence their opinion.
Well, Patrícia, I'd like to thank you very, very much for sharing your thoughts with us this morning. It was a real pleasure to listen to you. I think that we started with the right feet, with the right foot, this 2020 summer school program. I thank you also for the excellent work you have been doing all over this year in professional journalism, and I wish you best of luck in your brilliant career.
Thank you so much, Aziz, and thank you so much, you all, for being so generous to invite me to speak at such an important occasion. And thank you for, you know, if you have other questions, I'll just give you my email and you can email me. If I don't answer, just email back. It's because I missed the email. And thank you for all the work you're doing at the academia. This is really essential for our country at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. And
Bye.
thank you. Thanks to everybody for participating in this session, which is now over.